I see 5G being used quite a bit for data gathering, data compilation, and that in the test and training realm. But I also am very cognizant and aware of that is a different environment than an operational wartime scenario or conflict scenario.
Where the comfort zone. I mean, I pay extra to get status on these airlines, and I get all the lounges. Oh, the HGV. Yeah. Okay. All right.
Right.
Yeah, I met it.
Yeah, that's not fun. No. Yeah, no, I'm sorry to hear that. Where did Michael go?
I was sitting there thinking the same thing.
Yeah, I was saying hi to some of my constituents. That's way. My stakeholders.
I refer to those as hecklers, and I have, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
Oh, you
now
do?
that Rashad just walked in, 6.
Oh. The major heckler.
We got 6 or 7 troublemakers in the room, so feel that.
All right.
You bet.
All right. Good morning, everybody. My name is Tara Kilcullen-Oliva with Zygos Consulting. I am the chair for the simulation subcommittee, but I'm also chair for this session today. So just want to welcome you to our acquisition transformation, the convergence of test and training special event this morning. I just have a couple of quick announcements before we get started. Make sure your cell phones are silenced. It can be a bit distracting, especially who knows what kind of ringtone you have. No flash photography or video recording. You can take photos, just please make sure the flash is off. We are doing CEUs. This is for any sessions that you attend throughout the week. There are CEUs that are being given when you attend any of the sessions, so just make sure your badges are scanned when you enter the rooms. Otherwise, I'm going to hand things off to Ms. Whitney Winchester.
All right, thank you very much, Tara, and good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. This is our session, our panel. The first ever acquisition transformation, the convergence of test and training. Last year we did do a little bit, second time. 2 years ago, we did talk about this subject, but it was very limited in scope. And actually I had the pleasure of being on that panel, talking a little bit about what we do as far as our support to the Test Resource Management Center, and how we're looking forward to speeding delivery of some of our test systems. But you know, with some of the senior leaders that we've heard from yesterday and all through the last 2 months, the Army Transformation Initiative and the Secretary of the War coming forward and saying we need to speed delivery to the warfighter. If it's not increasing lethality, every delivery, we shouldn't be doing it, pursuing it. So our test and training communities are really have usually been on the back burner in suffering in programs, right? So we're usually fighting for resources, sometimes with each other. You know, being on the test and training ranges, you know, for range time, for frequency, for spectrum allocation. And sometimes we've been working in this stovepipe manner. And in my background, acquisition officer at CPE STRI in the Instrumentation Management Office, one of the little-known offices in STRI that focuses on test capability. But we work in an office that has and delivers training capability as well. But how often do we really intersect and leverage each other's expertise? So what we're trying to do now is move more forward to an environment where we're working synergistically together. Where can we optimize our resources and work together? And this is a great panel because many of the folks here are already walking down that path and probably have been for a few years now in advance of this direction that we're now headed towards within the Department of War. So a little bit more about me. I'm also an executing agent for the Test Resource Management Center, directed energy tests, electronic warfare tests, and also nuclear environments test. I know it's a lot, tell my boss, but also an acquisition officer and the acting deputy director for the IMO. So part of my job, actually my day-to-day job, is really to manage quite a few portfolios in critical technologies, and critical technologies test investments and capabilities. So a lot of what we're looking at now is how can we get to a 30, 40%, 50% solution that's suitable enough to be fielded, to be assessed, and then adopted at a very accelerated rate. Instead of, hey, let's test it, let's put it through its paces, okay, let's back up, let's go back to the lab, let's go forward, let's get it back into maybe an operational developmental test environment, and then let's back up to the lab. So instead of this start, restart cycle, we want to start from a place and then build on it incrementally in more of an agile fashion. And that's something that we've been trying to do and implement in the Test Resource Management Center, and we're pleased to see that the services are adopting that mindset as well. So in that manner, so today's discussion is really intended to allow you to walk away with a better understanding of how the ITSEC community can get involved here. We want to hear mostly from you, so this is an open forum. After we go through introductions of the panel, we're going to open up to questions. So even I'm going to ask the questions and kind of get us started. I'd really like to hear from you all about your ideas, your questions from the panel, and see how we can work together in a discussion. And then I do want to mention after this at 10:30 at the AMSO booth downstairs, this discussion can be continued, and so we'll continue to talk about that. So with us today are 4 test and training professionals from across the defense spectrum. First, we have Mr. Michael True, Chief Technology Strategy and Management Innovation Cell, Operational Test Command for Army Test and Evaluation Command, or ATEC. Also from the Army, we have Colonel Christopher Johns, Director, National Simulation Center. From the Air Force Life Cycle Management Center, Mr. Tony Scoop, Jerry, Test Chief for the Advanced Test and Training Division. And finally, we have Dr. Todd Steiner, Senior Principal Scientist, Test Resource Management Center. Thank you all for being here today. Like I said, we do not have the microphones or cards listed out here, so we want you to be brave and come forward and just raise your hand or just stand. And as I acknowledge you, you speak out and project so we can hear you, so the audience can hear your question or your discussion point, and so we can engage. All right, so we'll kick it off with introductions. And we'll start with Mr. We'll start with you.
Okay, we'll start with Mr. True. So I'm Mike True. I'm in the innovation cell at the Operational Test Command, which is a subordinate command of the Army Test and Evaluation Command. Our little cell was stood up almost 3 years ago with the advent of the Army's multi-domain operations doctrine being published. We took a look at that doctrine when it came out and quickly realized that there were a lot of gaps in those environments that the Army was envisioning to fight in, that we could not create realistic conditions for testing and collect the data in those realistic environments. So our executive director at the time stood up our innovation cell and said, we need a strategy to get after this. So we started with developing use cases, long-range use cases on what some of these major modernization systems in the Army were going to need. So we took a look at the future long-range assault aircraft. We took a look at our air and missile defense systems. We took a deep look at some of our robotic systems and the XM30 that were supposed to be autonomous or semi-autonomous. Started building use cases to flesh out what that might look like. And then we painstakingly created a strategy to get after that. That strategy was chugging along, and we had a lot of great partners in PEO STRI and other organizations that were pivoting and helping us build those things. And then the Army did another thing last year, which was publish the Army Transformation Initiative and the Transformation in Contact initiatives. And that changed the paradigm even further, because even though we were getting after MDOE, we were still getting after it in a more traditional testing manner, which was not keeping pace with our threat and the pace that the Army wanted to modernize or transform. So that transformation initiative and transformation in contact is driving the pace of our testing, and now that is also driving the convergence of test and training. Because in those transformation and contact documents, we're focusing on assessing prototypes, assessing systems faster in the hands of soldiers in training events. So our pivot was, how do we still get the required data at the right time to support the Army's ability to quickly assess those prototypes, make decisions, and move on quickly to improve or do something bigger and better. So we have this opportunity now that is forcing us to converge test and training. It's forcing us to move faster. So our challenge is to pivot our development strategy to be able to augment better a training event, to collect data faster, and to support a faster assessment, faster than we've ever had to do before. So we do have a plan, we do have a strategy. Be happy to talk about some of what our ideas are on how we're getting after that today. Get your feedback today as well, and your ideas on how you see it from your seat, because we don't see it from everybody's foxhole. But my background was as an armored cavalryman in the Army. Then I transitioned to Functional Area 57, which is being a simulations officer. I hung up the uniform but couldn't give up the mission, so I stayed on as a contractor and then a DA civilian at ITSEC, and here I am now trying to push innovation and push our development and investment strategy towards what the Army needs to do these assessments faster and more efficiently. So glad to be here, and I'll turn it over to my colleague, Colonel Johns.
All right, thanks, Mike. So good morning, Colonel Chris Johns. I am the director of the National Simulation Center in Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. A current FA-57 Simulation Operations Officer. So the NSC, right, we manage current simulations. We serve as a user representative to collect requirements to help development of future simulations, enable home station training, warfighter exercises, command post exercises, and combat training center rotations. Right? We either direct or support about 6 different sub-organizations between the Constructive Training Environment Division, the Mission Command Training Support Directorate. We have a small analysis and test team, and I say small, it's like 4 people. We have our CONUS Regional Simulation Center, and then kind of our other 2 organizations, the Sustainment Exercise and Simulation Directorate out of Fort Lee, Virginia, and then we've got the Integrated Training Directorate. And we brought a few of those hecklers here and sprinkled them throughout the audience so that they can answer all of your questions later on. To the note earlier, we'll continue this discussion downstairs for those that are interested. So we'll drag some of these folks along with us and have them ready to support. But the convergence of test and training, the way I looked at this is I wanted to come up here, and basically what I'll say to this is, what is old is new again. This is not necessarily a new thing, right? We've been doing it on and off at various degrees for quite some time, right? It falls in and out of popularity depending on where we are in time and space. So I'll give you a couple of vignettes real quick, just over the last 10, 15 years of what I've seen. So as a former director of the West Point Simulation Center, we worked with OSD, and there was a program called Thunderstorm. We would have different technologies come up to West Point, and then cadets would get the opportunity to go through and use some of these technologies. Now for the cadets, they were doing things like learning how to spell op order or enter and clear a building, but they were using this technology, and it enabled OSD to look at the technology and determine, is it something they wanted to pursue? It enabled people to do analysis and collection on the technology. At the same time, cadets were doing training on basic Army operations that they needed to learn at the academy. Fast forward a little bit to being the tax chief at the Joint Readiness Training Center, so that's training analysis, communication support, and simulation. Basically all of the technical things that make rotations at JRTC run, one of our combat training centers. Early on, as the synthetic training environment was bringing in the live training systems and some of those capabilities, we supported some of those test events out of JRTC, right? Again, similar to what I just described with the West Point Simulation Center. You had vendors coming in and testing out their technology. We had various test community representatives working along with the artist formerly known as PEO STRI, CPE today, to look at that technology and again decide if we wanted to move forward with it. Last job, I had the opportunity to do a one-year penance as the G7 for Army South, and worked with DevCom a little bit to bring some UAS capabilities into exercises in places like Chile with the 11th Airborne Division coming down, and those soldiers had the opportunity to work with DevCom, use these capabilities in a field environment and see how valuable it was for them or not. At the same time, they still continued the rest of the exercise that they were participating in, working alongside the Chileans. So we were taking tests and in some instances experimentation, mixing it with training, and not losing sight of the training requirements, but still being able to do some test and experimentation and provide value back to those organizations. Currently, with the National Simulation Center, one of the big pushes, and everybody's heard it, everybody's talked about it, everybody loves it, everybody wants more of it, is next-gen constructive, right? As the Army, we want next-gen constructive to be the be-all, end-all to all things. Right now, the focus, though, is Warfighter 27-1, right, which is next October. Despite all of the things that we want next-gen to be, that is the focus. Minimum viable product to execute a warfighter exercise. So in January, we're going to do a requirements validation event / risk reduction event with the Mission Command Training Program. For MCTP, that's a training opportunity for them. They will work on their processes, their procedures for running warfighter exercises, and they're gonna look at themselves and see how do they need to maybe make some modifications with the implementation of next-gen constructive once we get it to a capability that we can use to fully support warfighter exercises. For the National Simulation Center and the CFT and STRI and the various vendors that are supporting the development of NGC, it's an opportunity for us to look at it and go, okay, are we on glide path or not to get to Warfighter 27-1 in October, right? Does this capability scale to where we need it to be? Are we in an IL-5 or an IL-6 environment or some variant thereof? Can we talk to next-gen command and control? Can we talk to legacy simulation or legacy mission command information systems? So again, we're going to converge test and training in that environment. And then, you know, the combat training centers, I mentioned JRTC earlier. You look at JRTC, you look at National Training Center, MCTP, the Mission Command Training Program, Europe and the Pacific. The CTCs at one point in time were a place where you went to test and experiment. And then we got into the whole global war on terrorism, and that all turned into mission readiness exercises, and everybody said, thou shall not test or experiment at the CTCs. Well, we've shifted that mindset, right? Army senior leaders have said we're willing to accept risk at the same time that we're doing these training events. We won't lose focus of the training event, but we must test and experiment and iterate faster, right? All the lessons learned out there for Ukraine and what's happening in the modern day context, the model of let's experiment with it, you know, for 6 months, let's test with it for another 2 years, let's develop it and maybe get it out to production 5 years later, like that dog don't hunt. We don't have time for that, right? We have to test, we have to experiment, we have to train with it, we have to iterate faster, and we have to get it out faster. And with that, I will yield. Thanks.
Good morning. Tony Jerry, I go by Scoop, Division Test Chief for the Advanced Training Capabilities Division. Our portfolio includes, you guys have heard it a million times already in this conference, the Joint Simulation Environment. We've also got other tools like the Live Mission Operations Center. We've got P5, P6 trainer pods. We've got advanced threats and emitters, a whole family of those in our portfolio. And so what you're going to probably get a lot from me is from a DT, OT, and training perspective as it relates to program office and how we get things to the warfighter as fast as possible using the tools that we have and being able to be flexible. You'll hear a lot from me. You'll hear a lot of the words TTPs coming out of me. What I see as far as meeting Secretary's intent of getting things faster to the warfighter is, from a test perspective, going away from essentially a linear path when it comes to developmental and then operational test, and actually really meeting the true intent of what incremental development is by providing an operational intent to our requirements process within our acquisition systems so that we can build training scenarios and methodologies that actually don't just meet an SRD or a TRD requirement, but also meet an operational intent where we're answering the question of what capability does the warfighter need. And so within our own division, we have created what we have termed a capabilities verification document, which is not a traditional test document at all. But what it is a warfighter-centric document on how they're going to use systems in the field so that our developers can understand, not just from a system spec, I'm going to build a box, but I'm going to build this system that's going to be useful to the warfighter. So we've kind of transitioned within our own division from just doing more of a traditional test process to more of a warfighter-centric look at how we do requirements. And that is pulling in the warfighter and getting their inputs on how they're going to use the system so that we can at least meet the intent of that 30, 40, 50, 100% incremental development. Because at the end of the day, if I can give the warfighter and have expectations clearly communicated to the warfighter that at this increment, I'm going to give you this capability, at the next increment, I'm going to give you this capability, all the way to, we, no kidding, have a finished 100% product. I think the warfighter is able to manage those expectations. They're able to use whatever technology we give them at the time, knowing what limitations they have, as well as being able to go and use something earlier and give us real-time feedback as we're growing the system. And I affectionately term that, use the term, a growth path to a weapon system. And so you'll hear a lot about that. My background is, for the last 27 years, has been developmental and operational test, also chief engineer for T-37s and program manager for T-38 trainer systems. A lot of B-52 and F-16 DT and OT experience, and working with the various test organizations, as well as joint service, which I was telling Colonel Christopher, my best experience was actually joint service, because I absolutely loved working with the Army and seeing all the cool stuff that the Army had. So, but that's who I am, and so that's where I'm gonna focus in on how we do business and how industry can support and how the program offices can support getting product to the warfighter. With that, Todd?
Yeah, Todd Steiner. I'm with the Test Resource Management Center, TRMC, and the mission of TRMC is oversight and management of our test ranges. And so our areas of emphasis are in making sure that all the ranges have the capabilities for testing the wide variety of systems and some of the technologies to support that. So my role within TRMC is I'm the principal scientist for the Test and Evaluation Science and Technology program. And in that program, we have 10 test technology areas that include hypersonics, cyber, autonomy and AI, directed energy, electronic warfare, nuclear environments, space, advanced instrumentation, multi-domain integration, and spectrum efficiency. And so in each of these 10 areas, we have a tri-service working group. And so I work with each of those groups in developing their requirements that we then go out and provide opportunities for industry and academia to invest, or we invest in technologies to support the different ranges and capability improvements that are needed. And so our challenge in TRMC is we're working mostly with the testing community, but we are also engaging the developmental community and also the training community, and being able to have capabilities at our ranges, our test ranges, that are also useful at our training ranges as well. So this topic cuts across all 10 of our areas, and so I look forward to your questions.
All right, thank you so much. With that, we'll move to our first question. It's canned, so it should be a good one. Test and evaluation, or T&E, and training are two distinct domains or disciplines, but there's also some similarities, especially regarding technologies required to fulfill gaps. How do you see T&E and training being able to leverage or learn from each other to accelerate technology adoption and speed more lethal capabilities to the warfighter? I guess I'll call on you, Mr. Drew.
Sure, I'll take that one. It's a relative softball. I appreciate that to start things off. So one of our mantras in the Operational Test Command is that the first operational test with a system is the beta training event for that system. It's typically the first time that we're putting it in soldiers' hands in a realistic combat environment. So that involves getting training on the system. It involves establishing a live virtual constructive, whatever's necessary to evaluate that system. But it's still a training event at heart, because you're training on the system and you're providing a realistic environment. That's a training event. So that's always been there. What the main change is now is that we're on two different paths, and depending on what the system under test is. We have the traditional path that is used for some systems, like our aviation systems and our air missile defense systems, that allows us to have a longer planning lead time because it's a more complex environment. But we also have the path now of transformation and contact events, where we're taking prototype systems that are typically of less cost, but we're putting them in the hands of soldiers sooner. And so the key to that is collaborative planning, because the main difference that used to be, we're converging now, is that the main difference between a test event and a training event had to do with the data. That a test event required more data, required high fidelity data, and we use that as, oh, that's the big difference between it. You know, I've got to have a certain amount of data. My exercise, my event has to be more scripted. I want to reduce the number of variables to be able to compare different prototypes, but we don't have to do it that way anymore. Not with the technologies that we have available to us. But the key to that is both testers or assessors and trainers start early in the design of the event, so that we're melding both the training objectives of the commander and the data collection objectives that lead to an objective assessment at the end. If we can converge at the very design and learn from each other, the two communities who, to be honest, the testing community is pretty small, and we speak a different language than the rest of the Army. When I joined ITSEC 6 years ago, I had to learn to speak a different language because we approached it differently. Very data-centric, very analytical. While a training event, not so much, typically. It's focused on the commander and the commander's training objectives. So not only do we have to develop technologies to enable this, but it's also people-oriented. So we've got to start at the very beginning in the design of the event to meld those two and develop a set of tools that allow us to plan collaboratively. And that's one of the major initiatives that we have, is that set of tools that allows a venue for our testers, our army of ORSAs and analysts that want things done a certain way, and the trainers to come together at the very outset of the design to work out what the priorities are and how we can meld data collection and analytics with good old-fashioned training objectives, TTPs, task condition standards, to meet that commander's training requirements, at the same time getting good objective data to back up decisions on what those prototypes are. So that's how we're getting after it from our perspective.
That's an excellent response. In fact, it kind of teases sort of what the Secretary has been issuing in the form of memorandums, but also in his speeches out to the force. But it's outcome over process is now the focus, and I think that's pretty critical. Another thing you mentioned, the data collection standards. Absolutely right. In test, we do think about that a little bit differently than maybe some of our training counterparts in other areas of the force. But certainly, this having a data collection venue or event and looking at every event and training opportunity could be part of that. The critical data that we would need to make decisions. There's going to be more training opportunities than there necessarily are going to be test opportunities. And to maximize that would be great for both communities to learn from these data analytics and data-driven sort of assessments we should be making. Okay, thank you. Anything else from the panel on that question?
So I was going to say, there is the ability to collect a lot of data now, more than there was in the past. But what do we do with it? And so one of the things TRMC is looking at is using artificial intelligence tools to be able to look at things within that data that we have, and actually including test and training data as part of this huge data lake that we can both communities can use with the AI tools that we're developing.
Yeah, if I could just follow that up a little bit. Same thing. With this set of tools that we're developing to do design, plan, prepare, execute, assess, we envision that the environments are going to be more complex in a more free play training event than more traditional scripted testing event. Therefore, we need tools using artificial intelligence, machine learning, to be able to see the data we're collecting, understand what our data collection priorities are, and understand what the training objectives are, to be able to tell us quickly when we're not getting the amount or the right data to do an assessment. A pretty simple example would be with our XM30 prototypes. So the Army's got, the replacement for the Bradley XM30. There's two different companies competing, two different prototypes. We're going to put that into a series of exercises, training events that are going to culminate in about a year and 3 months or so in an NTC rotation. And an NTC rotation is pretty wide open. You got a free-thinking Op4. You've got a whole brigade of soldiers making decisions. And if prototype A, in their fight gets 12 engagements that we can look at in a particular mission for the day, while prototype B only gets 2 because of decisions that the soldiers using it made, decisions that the Op4 made. How do those variables affect my ability to assess both of those prototypes and compare them at the end? I need a tool that tells me that pretty quickly that I've got to adjust my scenario, that night mission needs to change in some way that makes sense to those being trained, because it can't be too artificial. It's still got to be a good training event. So we've got to have some help with those automated tools. We think AI ML can help us. We also have the people with the right mindset and creativity to be able to command and control that, so that we can get at the end objective data to make the assessment, not simply subjective data that we've relied on in other cases. Colonel Johnson.
One of my favorite things about this whole conversation with how do we take these things and put them together, the test and training piece, and then how do we collect the data, and we're having a lot of these conversations at the Combined Arms Center or Combined Arms Command now, and the various tools in which we're gonna collect. We're gonna collect from the CTCs, right? So like the Joint Readiness Training Center now has the ability for their data to actually go into an enterprise space. So between the CAC data team and call using Quickfire, they're trying to figure out how we're going to harvest all of that. But what ends up happening, you can go back and read call reports for decades, right? We are very, very good at observing the crap out of some lessons. We are very bad at learning them. So we're going to collect all this data, and it's going to be very informative, and it's going to your point, give us the opportunity to go, okay, had we looked at this, this event during the middle of the night, had we looked at all this data, we probably should have made an adjustment. We should have planned for a branch or a sequel, and we should have done something different in that fight. Okay. When we go and repeat that event, do we learn that lesson, and do we apply it? In the training space, that's something that I think we're going to continue to struggle with. We're going to have the data, we're going to have the information, and how effectively do we employ it, and do we employ it fast enough?
So within our own portfolio, one of the things that has becoming more prevalent on some of our programs is the inclusion of testers being incorporated into our programs, where we're actually using the systems to support test. P6, which is a ACMI pod based off of the CRIS pod that Afotech previously built. High capability to process information put them on a jet, fly it, collect data, take it down, and you can use it for both test and training, and so we're developing that. Of course, everybody has heard about JSC. One of the great things that I really enjoy is this convergence of test and training with JSC, because we have an AFOTEC team. We also have a 29th test team from the 53rd Wing. And so you have a training component to JSC, but you also have an AFOTEC component to JSC, where they are looking at ways of using this virtual environment, not only for training warfighters for a conflict, but also being able to inject experimental experimental scenarios and experimental technologies into the system ultimately, so that we can at least try it out in a virtual environment, where we kind of get a feel for, is this something that the warfighter wants? Do we need to tweak it a little bit more? Getting feedback from that warfighter from a test and a training perspective is invaluable to making that system more robust and effective as a warfighter simulation environment. We also have, again, I mentioned LMOC. LMOC started out as a small little program with the goal of reducing a 10-hour debrief time during a large force exercise down to about an hour. And it's been effective at doing that. And so it's basically built like an iPhone app. Warfighter, tell me what you need. We'll put it in there, and we'll make it a part of our pilot debrief. So a lot of what they're doing isn't just from a training perspective to debrief pilots after a large force exercise. It's also an experimental tool that we can go, hey, we'd like to have a little bit of experimentation with this. Do you like this? Is this going to help you be more effective as a warfighter? So there's quite a bit of that. And again, all these systems, both the P5, LMOC, and JSC, and some of our other programs, everything that we use goes back to TTPs. At the end of the day, it's about the warfighter and making them effective and being able to give them tools that aren't going to be cumbersome. And so I always remind our contractors and our primes that you can go through a whole entire acquisition process and pass DT, but once you get to OT, that program can fail if it does not meet the warfighter's intent. And it's a harsh reminder, but I feel like not just our contractors, but our acquisition community and our test community needs to be reminded that at the end of the day, if it does not meet our warfighter's intent and does not meet the capability needs of what that warfighter needs, then we're wasting money and we're wasting time. And so, again, I kind of harp on incremental development, because I firmly believe that's the way that we're going to be able to get things to the warfighter faster while managing expectations. That's what incremental development does. It manages expectations with the warfighter. It says, I'm going to give you this little bit. I realize down the road we're going to get this whole piece of pie, but I'm going to give you a little bit right now that you can use. So it's more of a crawl, walk, run approach, but it allows for that OODA loop to be effective, that feedback mechanism to get back to the test and training community to go, hey, we can adjust. And in turn, as we are developing these systems and growing these systems, what it does for the warfighter, it allows them to get another tool in their toolbox where they can go, do we need to adjust our TTPs? Do we need to adjust our ConOps on how we're using this tool to be more effective or not? And it allows for that rapid engagement and rapid adjustment in a world that's constantly changing, where the scenarios are going to constantly change, and we need to be flexible enough and provide that to our warfighter. And if it helps them, and kind of like what the general said the other day, if we have done something that keeps them alive, then we've been effective. Whitney.
Okay, yeah, that's a perfect segue almost into my next question. So we talked a little bit about some of those test and training tools and support systems. So I guess to pull the thread a little bit more, I guess are there more, or how and what of these test and training tools and support systems are being developed and integrated across the two communities to enable simultaneous test and training? Any takers?
I could go first again.
Sure.
So, common tools. I sort of spoke on that a little bit in the last answer with common planning tools that we can collaborate with the training community to balance training objectives and data requirements for assessments. But it's more than just planning tools. Those planning tools are linked to the tools that help us provide realistic environments, our live virtual constructive tools, the networks that support an event to be able to collect and move that data. So, luckily we did have some foresight years ago, and we were kind of forced to that. The Army Test and Evaluation Command, the Operational Test Command, we don't have big budgets. We're a pretty small organization, a small slice of the Army. We could not afford to develop our own standalone testing systems. We had to use training systems that already existed and adapt those for testing purposes. So our partners at PEO STRI, especially, who've developed most of those systems for the Army, already had tools in existence that supported home station training and supported the combat training centers. So we could take those tools and adapt those. Now here we are at a point where we are augmenting mostly training events for transformation and contact, not standing up our own separate test events. So our tools are poised to be able to do that, to augment home station training where necessary and augment combat training centers where necessary to provide some of that realistic operational environment to make it more realistic that the training community, it wasn't a priority for them, but it was for us. But I built those tools, we built those tools in the same basic architecture that allows us to integrate them easier. And that's what we're kind of poised to do now, is to start doing that integration and augmentation to provide things like the RF spectrum and fighting in a realistic RF spectrum, fighting in a realistic degraded APNT mode that we've been leaning forward on probably a year and a half now. Poised to bring that in to provide more realistic environments for things like next-gen command and control. Our unmanned air systems, our unmanned ground systems will be heavily affected by that RF spectrum and that degraded APNT environment. So how can we do that? How can we integrate? Well, it's about being in the same languages, the same architectures as the existing systems and augment them as necessary, because we don't have time to plan and stand up our own. We're always going to be augmenting. One of the things we say in the Operational Test Command is we're always playing an away game. We don't have our own ranges. We don't have our own training areas. We've always been doing that, so this is just an extension of that. We're just going to be doing it even more and even faster, and that's how we have to look at it. So my take on it.
Anything else from the panel? Okay. A lot of good mentioning there of common architecture and tools. And one thing I want to go back to, kind of something that I think Scoop mentioned, but the value of experimentation. Some of the focus that the Secretary and the Army Transformation Initiative has been on has been some of these experimentation exercises or events that we've been seeing are ongoing in operational theaters today. So from your perspective, what value does experimentation campaigns or training events bring to bear? And how does the test and training convergence impact what we can do with those experimentation events?
That's a great question, Whitney. One of the conversations I've had with the Air Force Test Center in the IDO office was specifically about experimentation and how we incorporate that into test and training. And so there's a big move within the Air Force for more experimentation. And the reason why is if I can get something to the warfighter now and ask them, does this meet your need? Does this meet at least 30%, 40%? I would rather have that feedback now so that I can get that feedback and go, okay, what am I missing? How can I make this better? What do you need as far as capability? And get that feedback so that when we are actually in that acquisition environment, we can actually go back and reference what the warfighter actually needs. Because a lot of times what we get is we'll get this laundry list in the form of a TRD or an SRD or something like that that is more akin to a spec. Build me this box. But if I have something that I kind of know that they need, but they're having a hard time describing, I can at least go, I can give you this now, tell me what I'm lacking. And what that does is, one of the great things that has come out of acquisitions in the last few years, I believe, has been the middle tier acquisition construct. And I remember the Army, retired Army GO that was like the DOD SME. I remember being paired with him, and within a week, he taught me more about middle tier acquisition than I could in like a DAU or a course. Because at the end of the day, the great thing about middle tier acquisition is you pull in your warfighters. Your requirements people are your warfighters. It's not guys sitting at desks, it's your warfighters. And so we pulled in those guys, and we literally said, we're not gonna talk about the acquisition statutory documents. We're gonna talk about what the warfighters need and what the capability gaps that they have. And we're gonna start there, and we're gonna build our requirements from there so that we can actually get at least a prototype to them so that they can use it, give us feedback via OODA loop, and then we can improve it. Because what we're giving them is essentially a prototype. Tell me if this meets your need or not. And I would add to that the capabilities verification plan that I mentioned earlier. My prior boss was Colonel Matt Ryan. He was a test pilot graduate, DG, out of pretty much every school he's ever been to. Probably one of the biggest brains I've ever met in my life, and he was so awesome at providing mentorship to me on out-of-the-box thinking when it comes to test and training. And he and I had that conversation, and I brought up this idea, and it wasn't even called a capabilities verification plan. I didn't even know what to call it. I just said, I need something that communicates what the warfighter needs and how they're gonna use it. And he said, I got something for you. And he worked the B-21 program, and he wrote that 1,000-page capabilities verification plan for the B-21 that allowed it to get produced a lot faster than a normal ACAP program would. And he said, that's essentially what you're asking for, is a capabilities verification plan. And so in my mind, if you take a middle tier acquisition construct and you couple that with a capabilities verification plan, you're gonna get product faster to the warfighter. Because at the end of the day, middle tier acquisition, I concluded at the end of that lesson from that Army general, that if I have a good set of requirements, I can build something that will be useful. And regardless of all of the acquisition statutory documents that is needed, because at the end of the day, all those statutory documents aren't really gonna support the warfighter. The only thing that's gonna support the warfighter in those documents are gonna be manuals and TOs, right? The rest of it is for sustainment. But if you need something to get to the warfighter, you need a system to get to the warfighter, and you need something that they can look at and they go, okay, I know how to operate this. And so, in my mind, if you really want to bridge the gap when it comes to experimentation, that middle tier acquisition construct plus a capabilities verification plan would be my recommendation.
So I want to throw something on experimentation here just for a brief second. And in our space, we talk about experimentation being big E's or little E's from time to time. And I think it's important that we distinguish, right? So we're talking about warfighter experimentation right now back at Combined Arms Command and Combined Arms Command training with the Mission Command Training Program, and then we're doing some of that with the CPX support. But experimentation in warfighters is more often than not like, hey, I'll give you an additional artillery battery to this unit task organization. And how effective is that? What did that do for you? That's not the same as I'm gonna give you this brand new munition with some kind of increased probability hit, probability of kill, or I'm gonna give you this type of vehicle that has X fuel capacity, it can go so far, or it operates off it. Like, so there's a difference in our space, particularly as we talk about experimentation. And it is very important that we differentiate exactly what it is we're trying to get after, because frankly, the term, I'll use the example of authoritative data. The term gets used and thrown around loosely, and sometimes it can be very dangerous in what we're talking about. Sure. And authoritative data is like my new favorite thing here of the last couple of weeks, right? Because everybody loves it, but yet I challenge anybody to tell me exactly what it is and how it's going to work in some of the spaces that we're looking to use authoritative data in the Army right now. So, but it's important that we distinguish specifically what we're getting after in experimentation, because the experimentation that our capability developers do, that, we're Battle Labs, now seated, pick your acronym for this week, what we're calling them based off of the way we're changing organizational structures right now. But the work that they do versus us doing experimentation in CPXs or warfighters is significantly different. So.
I think I want to pile on a little bit. So, we could have easily called this panel the convergence of training, testing, and experimentation. It's all really coming together. Three separate areas of the Army in the past that are converging because we have to go fast. So Colonel Johns mentioned the different types of experiments. So we're taking prototype systems and we're giving them to units to train with at home station. We're doing assessments, we're making decisions on which ones to keep, which ones not. And as we're doing that, this new piece of equipment is changing ideas. We're really experimenting with it at the same time as we're assessing its effectiveness, because the unit has to adapt to that new capability. It's got to change its organization, change its TTPs. So some cases more than others, it's pretty dynamic. So in our data collection, we're not just collecting the data on the system, but we're collecting data from the soldier, the warfighter, who comes in with a set of capability gaps that it thinks it's going to fill. But in operating with this new set of kit, whatever it might be, unmanned ground vehicle, air vehicle, a new communication system, it figures out that, wait, I can maybe do more. If the environment is realistic enough, we can make some pretty good decisions on changing TTPs, changing organizational structure. That has to be included in your design of the event, and your event's got to be flexible enough to change, to say, okay, day 1 and 2 of this 7-day exercise, for example, I had XM30s paired with one each autonomous ground vehicle and one each air vehicle. That was not effective enough. I found that if I had 2, I could cover 3 times as much ground in this hasty defense, for example, or movement of contact, you name it. Can we change our TTP fast enough, collect the data on that, so at the end, we make a recommendation on a formation and a task organization at the same time as we're evaluating the effectiveness of that particular system to engage targets at a particular range, for instance. So a lot more variables, and you can get a lot more outcomes simultaneously if the training audience, the testers, the experimenters are all collaborating on the same platform, have access to the same data, and that data becomes king, right? To make sure that we can all get access to it. Somebody mentioned the quickfire database, which is where the transformation and contact data is going, so we can all access it for our systems. And sometimes we're going to make some assessments and do some later analysis and maybe dig up things that we didn't know. Well, since there's transformation and contact events going on constantly, both at home station and CTC now, because it's a constant cycle, we have the opportunity to inject that lesson learned, not just observed, back into another event because we're sharing the same data across that enterprise. So the data is key. Experimentation is going to be a part of this, just inherently. So we can easily expand this to include all three of those major areas.
Excellent. Yeah.
So I have a question for the panel, and I think a lot of what everyone's talking about is would like to have or starting to develop in processes, and we all know that a directive or something gets mentioned and it's getting pushed down. A lot of times it takes the folks, the ground troops, so to speak, to kind of really start that change because of cultural. A lot of times, especially when we're talking about test and training, they have been such separate silos for so long and not a lot of conversation going between the two. And we really need to start leveraging the technologies that exist there, and not just from a single service perspective, but from a cross-service perspective, especially as we talk about larger test and training events. So what is it that you or your folks are doing, or that folks from industry can help support to enable this change from that perspective? There's things that I know each service is going to be doing, and then what you could potentially be doing for cross-service. Whoever wants to take that first.
So I'll give an example. A few years ago, I was working some ICBM programs, and there was this requirement for their security forces units out in the missile fields to have secure radios. So they went out and had a company come in and did the sales pitch. They bought a bunch of radios, and I was just like, and they were having a lot of problems. And so I said, I'll bet the Joint Services has something that already meets this need. And so I went to Fort Belvoir and met with the Army radio PM, and there was a whole suite of them. Everything from, the average troop out there using this series of radios, to a little bit more high fidelity, a little bit more stealthy, and then encrypted. They even had stuff that was like, oh yeah, this will work in caves and stuff like that. It was eye-opening. And come to find out, they had already got the same radio, and what they have done was they've been working on this system for over 6 years. They had incorporated it into their, is it MPs or SPs in the Army? Their military police, I guess, MPs. So they've already optimized the vests. Our security forces guys out in the missile field still had wires hanging out. And I went back and I was like, dude, what the heck? Joint Services, the Army has got a whole entire portfolio of these radios. And the one that you guys are trying to fix, they've already had for 6 years. So I would say, if we're looking for things, we need to go look at it from a joint service perspective. There's commonality, and the great thing that would have just been candy was the fact that the Army had already worked the sustainment for it. And so as we're doing our alternatives, our analysis for alternatives, look at joint services. I would highly, highly recommend that we do that as we're looking for these new technologies, because I'm pretty sure the joint services have already figured it out. And you know, it's an unfortunate example, but I wanted to give that example because that is a lessons learned that we need to take, and we need to have more commonality, one, between all of our services anyways, and the amount of money that the Air Force would have saved just by going, not having to iterate again on the lessons that the Army had already learned for that particular radio.
Well, I want to hit two parts of your question. The first with cultural change. When you look at any kind of change in an organization, changing culture takes the longest, takes the most constant pressure to do that. And you know, it's still human organizations. We're really focused on technology in this community. But ultimately, people have to know it, understand it, and have trust and confidence to use it. One of our big challenges is, we developed so many technologies over the last couple of years because we've been going fast. But one of our major challenges is making sure that our units in the Operational Test Command are our test directorates, and that's test officers, that's ORSs, that's technologists, who have to be comfortable and trust those technologies that we're developing. And that takes time. So it's a resource thing. Time is a resource to be able to get comfortable with it. And the more we use something, the more comfortable we're going to be, which takes me to one of those cultural changes has to do with risk. We are typically a very risk-averse organization as a whole, but our senior leaders have given us a mission and a mandate and the ability to accept more risk. That 50% solution faster is better than the 90% solution slower. It's going to take a while for that to sink in, but if we are embedded from the very beginning of any event or series of events with the training unit and using a common set of tools that we can collaborate on, we're building trust. So what we've done over the last 6 months or so is in supporting TIC events is mostly about bringing people to help with the expertise to do data collection and analysis that the units don't have. Our divisions and corps, I don't think brigades, are standing up operational data teams. New construct, while our test directorates within our organization, well, that's our bread and butter, it's what we do. So partnering with them has led to a lot of collaboration. And because there's so many events going on simultaneously, sometimes this is one or two people augmenting this unit, but coming in with expertise that has been really invaluable. Doing pretty simple stuff. We're not integrating a lot of grandiose technologies yet. It's just a simple matter of bringing expertise on our part of a fight that gets at slowly chipping away at that cultural change. That the way we design an event, training event, a readiness event, from now on can be more data-centric to support experimentation, testing, and the training objectives at the same time. And then looking across the joint services to find capabilities, much easier said than done. How do you find the information? So one of the things we did at OTC when we were given this MDO mission and we developed those use cases, we found huge knowledge gaps. And then we found it a huge challenge to go find that knowledge on what's out there that we could bring to bear. So we had to step back for a moment and said, we don't know the whole environment. So we initiated systems engineering and integration projects where we had teams go out and really research, take the time to research before making decisions on what to invest in. And that's something that paid big dividends. You know, prime example is in air and missile defense, where we had a lot of gaps. There are a lot of tools out there that we were not touching or using. And at the end of that project and that study, we had a set of models, simulation, stimulation that could be brought to bear. We necked that down, you know, using a pretty fair amount of analysis on what could we actually integrate into our system quickly, because there's a lot of stuff out there. I mean, we looked at JSE, and we're still looking at JSE for some of those capabilities. But when you paired the capability with the speed of integration and the cost of integration, that's where you have to make some tough decisions, and have your priorities straight. So, great question. Just wanted to add that.
So you asked about how does industry, you know, help us do these things, right? And these various venues, the organizations such as yours, such as the test communities, those are kind of the entry points, right? Those are the places where companies, vendors, et cetera, can find ways to, like, hey, I have this solution to a problem set, right? That's kind of how they get in. For us, as we look across services, we look across organizations, right? One of the things that I typically share with any organization that I'm part of is, okay, how do we find ways to get to yes, right? You can say no, but it has to be no but, and this is how we get to yes, right? Like, yeah, you're authorized to use the word as long as you tell me how that word then leads to us getting to a yes. And information assurance, cybersecurity folks, they're some of my favorite out there with the lawyers and, you know, the SJA types. Like, it's hello, my name is no. Okay, cool, but now tell me how we get to yes, right? Like, and then part of the other thing that I typically share with organizations is tech planning principles. Don't get stuck in our stovepipe. Our solution may not be the best solution, so how do we go out and find the answer to the problem set? Doesn't matter if we own it or not. There may be another way to do it. But as we talk about other organizations, other services, other capabilities, you know, then it becomes a cost benefit analysis, right? Can we, hey, here's a solution over here that the Air Force or the Navy has. Can we do it? How can we do it? What is it going to cost us? Oftentimes the homework has been done. We just need to figure out what is the vehicle to leverage that.
Right.
And if you spend the time, you can get creative and figure out how to leverage each other's contracts and capabilities, but sometimes it's more expensive than you have the budget to deal with, especially in the current environment. So.
Thank you. Yeah, and I do want to give Todd the opportunity to chime in on the OSW level organization, TRMC, and where they play between the services. But we know the Army is organizing around capabilities. So we're organized now to have this freedom of maneuver between the disciplines, between the offices that have been a little bit stovepiped in the past. So I'm interested to see how the TRMC intends to implement the Secretary's guidance and ensure that these lessons learned are heard and adopted throughout the services.
Well, let's see. So we have our, oops, I'm getting ready to fall off the stage. We have our 10, within the S&T program, we have our 10 test technology areas, but in a broader sense, we have 13 different investment roadmaps in TRMC, and those were aligned to the old 14 priorities of R&E, research, OSD R&E, but now there are 6 identified. And let's see, those were, one was hypersonics, one was directed energy, biomanufacturing, quantum, logistics, and AI. So we're aligned in hypersonics, directed energy, AI. We were aware of the quantum, and we're getting ready to look at that. We're not so much, we've been out of the bio area, and we haven't really been in logistics. But we are looking to align our investments in test infrastructure to the department priorities, those 6. I'm not sure if that was the question you were asking, but we are very engaged with the community out there. We have lots of opportunities for all the different stakeholders in the services to provide requirements, okay? And that includes the S&T community as well as the test ranges, okay? And so we do have a broad, each of our groups has on the order of 75 people in the services that give us input on requirements. So that's a huge casting of a net that we've done, so.
Absolutely, yeah, just to chime in on that too, just in my capacity as executing agent, especially for these critical technologies development, it's easier for us to kind of look across services with all of our stakeholders and say, this investment may be duplicative, or I know this has been invested in elsewhere. And I think we see it more with the new, like hypersonics, like directed energy, electronic warfare, where some other services may be leaning further ahead than others, that we can share with those stakeholders in these developments to say, hey, let's not develop an Army-only solution here. We already have something we can adopt. And I think that's also, it kind of draws a line to this test and training scenario where we can do the same thing between these two communities. So I think it's very important to just iterate that not only is the Army organizing around this principle, but the Office of the Secretary of War is doing the same and has been trying to do that, for some time now.
I was going to say though, Whitney, the bigger need for information exchange, we talk in the acquisition community about the valley of death,
Yep.
right? And so this test and training convergence helps us address that. But what we basically got in the valley of death is we've got the combatant commands or the warfighter that has needs, okay? They don't understand what the technologies are or the capabilities to meet those needs. We have the S&T or the acquisition community that has stuff that they're working on, and they're trying to push that. So we have these two, and in between is this valley. We need more opportunities like this, but we need more opportunities to get those communities together, okay, and exchange information. Just recently, the Joint Staff's process for requirements, JSIDS, they're reworking it, right? That used to be a way for communication. There used to be meetings between the COCOMs and all the services on integrated priorities lists, JSIDS, all of these things, and now that's all being re-engineered. So somehow we've got to get that community back together so that we can have the capability and S&T people understand what the missions are and how they can do something differently to affect that mission.
Yeah, excellent. And this kind of draws the ties between actually the two things, that and then also, rapid technology adoption. What's going to bridge that gap is, the S&T folks, the scientists, the PhDs, the testers, very comfortable with this technology and data, but we can't translate that to commanders, to warfighters in a way that they'll understand it. They don't understand, your percentage, your probability of survival here is 20%. Do you go forward with course of action A or B? So we have to be able to talk, in the same language, and think that's part of that, having that integrated product team that really is of different disciplines and mindsets, and can we communicate between each other? So I want to pull a thread a little bit more, and that kind of ties back to, Mr. True, what you said about risk aversion, a culture of that starting to change, and should be changing as quick as possible. Because being able to accept risk is going to enable us to go forward with rapid technology adoption. That's something our adversaries have been very good at, something that we have been slow to adopt new and emerging technologies. And probably somewhere where industry can help us too, because they've already been adopting and implementing new cutting-edge technology, hardware sets and open architectures that they've been implementing even in different industries away from just the defense industrial base. So given that, the pace of technology and change, but also what we've seen in other operational theaters as far as global conflict. We've seen the threat adapt very quickly, almost on the spot, in battle, in conflict. And how do we emulate that as far as being able to test new technologies and throw in, hey, you can use this system for this, or the warfighter may use it for a different purpose. How do we emulate that in training environments, and how do we account for that in our test constructs? And I know that's a difficult question, but I'm going to open it up to whoever on the panel is willing to go after it.
You want to hit it from the training and the unit side?
At the risk of saying that we are not necessarily as creative as we want to be or ought to be from time to time. Yeah, I mentioned earlier CTCs are changing, and the way we look at CTCs are changing. We're affording units and commanders the opportunity, if you will, to go out and look at various threat sets that are put in front of them, and then they have a lot of latitude now in terms of how they deal with those problem sets. What we don't necessarily have is the vast array of enemy capability, if you will, to throw at them and continuously force them to adapt. So we're trying to expand those footprints. We're trying to expand those capabilities to force our leaders and our units to have to adapt on the fly. But again, how much can we do that, right? So we're challenged because your combat training centers are really the only place that you have frankly, the space, right? Like, not the space in the sky, but, well, there's some of that too, but the actual land space for us to utilize. Home station training, you're even, reduced further in terms of what you have at your disposal to get after this stuff. Now, we can do some things in the virtual environment. We're trying to use things like games for training and have units and organizations learn to react and deal with small UAS and how do they do counter UAS training, and then we have some limited capability to do that at various home stations. But the CTCs are really the only place that we have enough actual land, if you will, to get after these larger problem sets and to be able to throw more threat variables at units and organizations. And then even for the Army, like, our combat training centers are great, but our combat training centers don't necessarily have enough for us to enable the combined joint force, right? As we were talking briefly before the panel kicked off, we've been challenged to get the Air Force, Air Combat Command, to want to participate much with the CTCs because, frankly, to a fighter pilot, right, like something like JRTC, and I had a former fighter pilot tell me this, is like, yeah, JRTC is mildly entertaining at best because it's like less than 90 seconds from one side of the box to the other, and all we're going to do is make left turns all day long like NASCAR. Like, that's nothing for us. So it's, even as large as our combat training centers are, and NTC is much bigger, but when you're talking 5th gen fighters, like, NTC is mildly entertaining at best. And then how do we pull in the Navy to that, right? People get excited if you want to park a carrier strike group off the coast of Louisiana or something like that. But we do some of these things in the simulation environment, but again, how do we throw all the variables at all of our units and organizations? We lack the space to do that really well.
So yeah, we talked about cultural change. We've talked about risk aversion. That's going to take some time to accept. How do we mitigate or help that change, and how do we mitigate risk? The unit's training objectives, because ultimately they're training for some kind of deployment, and so that's foremost in the mind of the commander. That trumps everything. We as a community, as the testers augmenting to do these assessments, have to build trust with that commander and his staff that are planning these events, where he's tasked to be ready for a deployment and provide assessments on prototypes to help Army transformation. That trust comes in, I think, what we're aiming at is a common set of tools to collaborate on. So we're learning from each other, where there's a give and take, there's a compromise that's happening during that planning process. And for our organization, we've got to be okay with accepting risk in our data collection, and our assessments aren't going to be 100%. They're going to be the best that we can do, but we can do better with a common set of tools and common understanding between the training audience and those collecting data for assessments. I think the more open system architecture we see in systems and our training and testing support systems is going to help. A lot, I shouldn't say a lot. Some of our prototypes have embedded systems that will allow us to get more comfortable with them and with the units to inject operational environments and test operational environments in those embedded systems. We have to continue to pull that thread, and we as a community have to really raise our voices to the PMs and the developers to demand that in their capability documents, that it can't be a standalone system. It's got to be able to be integrated into a larger system of systems that we can stimulate and collect data from. We haven't been very good at that in the past. We've taken some steps, but it's not good enough for us to move as fast as we want to if those systems don't have that open architecture that we can really plug into early, maybe even not in the field, but prior to being in the field, that allows the unit to get comfortable with that prototype system before it even goes to the first home station event, much less a CTC rotation. Those kind of things I think will help with getting after acceptance of risk and also mitigate, some of that risk to integrating these prototypes in a multitude of different exercises.
I'll just add a quick note from an acquisition standpoint. Faster is definitely equal to more risk, but when it comes to M&S, we can take a ton of risk. That's where we're gonna benefit from a warfighter perspective, because we can run through scenario after scenario after scenario. And even before M&S was just a twinkle in somebody's brain, that term, we were doing this, like you said, a long time ago. And I'll give you an example. Years ago, I got tasked to join a B-52 unit to fix how they train and test for nuclear cruise missile tests. And so what we did was we duplicated the Mission Control Center, had the whole entire test director, flyers, backseaters, engineers. We had a whole entire team out at Hill Air Force Base executing tests. And so what we did back at home station was we duplicated using that old, I don't know if you guys remember LabVIEW. We actually used LabVIEW to duplicate the Mission Control Center. Exactly. And what we did was we would run through scenarios 3 times a week, and we built what we call Dial a Disaster. And just for reference, on a typical test mission with two B-52s, a 12 chase plane, F-16 from the 422, and then a couple of other aircraft to include 2 tankers, we would usually have about 3 incidents that we would have to respond and have decisions made immediately, because you're flying with a cruise missile. You've got airplane jets in the air, so you had to be able to make decisions really quick. So during those sessions, those modeling and sim sessions, we would literally set up kind of a boot camp, and we would run through about 20 or 30 of them in 3 hours. We had guys yelling and screaming. It was, no kidding, like having drill sergeants in the room. But what it did was it allowed us to develop muscle memory from a decision-making standpoint. And when we got out there, and we would do this, we'd have like grown men crying because the pressure, we wanted to put so much pressure. I don't know if you can do it today, but there was so much pressure in those training sessions that we would have just literally grown men crying. But by the time we got finished and ready for the mission, the decision-making was almost instantaneous, and it didn't matter what the scenario was. And so in a live situation, completely different. There's less risk that we're willing to accept, and I don't think that's going to change. The advantage that we have with M&S is we can train and we can test and we can fail as many times as we need to learn, and pulling in AI and some of those algorithms, the machine learning allows us to assess faster so that we can adapt and learn faster. Because at the end of the day, when we're talking CCA and some of the autonomy type of warfighting tools that we're going to have, we need to be able to train those systems to react intelligently and safely. I like what the Navy subcommander said about risk the other day. There's things that he is not going to accept risk. And every warfighter has that on the back of their mind. There's things that are absolutely, we are not going to risk. Specifically, people, if we can do it, safe combat situation. But the tools that we have on hand are going to make warfighting, especially the M&S, the live virtual construct, is going to make life so much easier for us to train.
All right, thank you so much. We're about out of time for this session, unfortunately. But like we mentioned before, there is going to be a continued conversation downstairs at the booth. So if you'd like to ask your questions in a more private setting, and especially with some more subject matter experts around, we certainly look forward to engaging with you. So thank you again for attending. This hopefully was helpful for you all. We hope to continue this conversation, how test and training can continue to converge, how we can go faster, and ultimately it all builds up to building that operational dominance. So I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference, and if we could give a big thank you to our panel here for jumping through hoops and getting here approved. It was great. Again, I thank you, and enjoy the rest of the conference.
Colonel John's pleasure. It was good.